probably take breaks at various points during the presentation just to gauge questions, and I want to hear your questions. I will not be able to answer anything that gets into too specific of sort of a legal fact pattern. So just so everyone's clear. Alrighty, so, as you guys have probably been able to see from a lot of our communications at NAR and things we're doing, fair housing is really, truly a priority for the organization. We want to, all right, hold on one second. I apologize. It's virtual lunchtime here on the East Coast, so my first grader needed something. This is the fun of Zoom, right? These days. But so as I was saying, we're really focused on fair housing at NAR. Just a few years ago, we didn't even have a single staff person dedicated solely to fair housing matters. Now we have 3 on our fair housing team. We have myself, our VP of Policy Advocacy, Brian Green, who had a very illustrious career as the head of enforcement of fair housing at HUD. So he's an incredible wealth of knowledge. And we recently hired a senior policy representative, Alexia Smokler, who also works on these issues. And so while we're very focused on it, what else is happening at NAR is that we're really working across the organization to ensure that all programs and departments at NAR are focused on fair housing. So education, media, diversity and inclusion. Fair housing is supposed to be a part of everything we do as realtors. And really, housing is fair housing. Fair housing is housing. And that's really the idea we at NAR want to get across. We don't just want it to be siloed off as this little thing you sometimes remember about. No, we really want to make sure that it's permeating everything that we're doing as realtors and everything we're showcasing. So talk about a little bit what's happening now. We're gearing up for our mid-year conference in DC, right? The NAR one that focuses mostly on policy matters. And then we're planning on having our virtual Hill meetings as well following the conference. And there's sort of 3 buckets that we're really operating under from a policy perspective. The first one is improving access to home ownership. So, we're really kind of going to the issue of supply and demand that we know is so misbalanced in so many places. We know that demand is insane, and we know that supply is incredibly low. And in terms of thinking about that from a fair housing perspective, it's, well, who's getting access to what little supply is there, right? Who has access to the financing? What is the cost of their financing? What's the availability of it? And, if you're looking at types of financing, let's say you're looking at an FHA loan, if in a situation that an FHA loan is just not going to be competitive, well, how does that affect perhaps a protected group? How does that affect certain populations? This is sort of what I'm getting to in that while we're thinking about supply and demand, we're also thinking generally about fair housing and access as well, even in these other areas. Another big area of focus is building strong and resilient communities. That's getting more to that infrastructure question. We're ensuring that the housing stock is well built. We want to make sure there's enough of it. We want to make sure that transportation is good. We want to make sure that pipes and water are good in communities. This is all important. What's the fair housing angle? Well, again, it's about which communities are getting maybe that support. Like, where is the funding going to improving the infrastructure? You want to make sure that it's going out fairly, that it's really going to ensure that all groups, all communities are fairly getting the housing needs that they need. And then, of course, our last big bucket is actually ensure fair housing for all. Again, pretty self-explanatory. NAR, we're about making sure that fair housing is everywhere. So I just want to get into a little bit of the data that we have that really goes into what's been sort of focusing a lot of our fair housing work for a better part of this year. So I'm going to share just first a little bit about what I mentioned with the supply and demand data. So from a national perspective, for example, in February, properties were typically on the market for 20 days compared to 36 days the year before. Existing home sales rose about 9% in February. And I think along with that, the median home price for all housing types rose to $313,000 in February. That is a 15% increase from just a year ago. And not only that, this is an ongoing price escalation. It is that was the 108th consecutive month of year-over-year gains in pricing. And that is a concern, because housing, we want to make sure that people have access to housing, and cost of housing comes into that. And so when you start seeing these really crazy numbers coming up, you have to stop and think. Another big issue is just inventory. There was a 30% drop in inventory year over year from February, 30%. And we are going into, I think, about the 23rd straight month of year over year declines in inventory. Essentially, right now, it would take 2 months to sell everything that's available. That's it. Just 2 months of inventory. So it is a tough time out there. Now, again, I want to talk a little bit about, so what does this mean for certain groups, for certain populations that we sometimes talk about when we talk about fair housing? Well, so let's just talk about the homeownership rate generally. The US homeownership rate was 64% in 2019. For non-Hispanic white Americans, that was actually 69.8%, so a little bit higher than the average. However, you look at the Black homeownership rate, that's 42%. That is a gap of almost 30% between Black homeownership and white homeownership. In addition, when you look at Asian American and Hispanic homeownership rates, those are also lower. Asian Americans at 60% and Hispanic Americans at 48%. So there is, unfortunately, there is a divide when we're looking at groups and we're looking at homeownership rates. And that is something that is a concern. Again, when you're talking about access to housing, when you're talking about fairness and being able to purchase a housing, these are just the little numbers that you kind of keep in the back of your mind, like, okay, this needs to be investigated. I think maybe more focused way of looking about it is looking at rejection of mortgage loans. For example, Black applicants are rejected from mortgage loans at a rate 2.5 times greater than white applicants. That is a 10% rate versus a 4% rate. In addition, right now, only 43% of Black households could afford to buy the typical home, compared to 63% of white households. Adding to that problem is the fact that Black households are more than twice as likely as white households to have student loan debt. So 43% for Black households versus 21% for white households. The level of the student loan debt is higher as well. It's about $40,000 for Black households and $30,000 for white households. And I bring this up because, student debt is by far one of the largest reasons when we do our research, when we check in with would-be buyers, with potential borrowers, when they say that it's, something's preventing them from buying a home, a lot of times it's the debt load that they have. And that debt load is very, very much tied to their student debt load. It prevents a lot of would-be first-time buyers from developing the down payment needs in order to get into a home. So that's a lot of trouble. And now everything I just shared, that is data that NAR has collected. So, I just want to stop because every time there's a big data dump, I just want to quickly make sure nobody has any questions or anything was too confusing before I go on. No? Great. Wonderful. So again, why am I sharing this data dump? Why am I telling you all about this? Well, part of it is again, the driving force behind the Fair Housing Act was to ensure that all Americans can enjoy the benefits of the housing market, of benefits of ownership, of having your own home, of the financial security it provides, of the stability it gives to your family, to your kids. We see that there are better education outcomes for children when they live in, their family owns their home. Generational wealth building, all of you are realtors, it is the number one asset, the number one wealth builder for most Americans is their home. Homeownership improves communities. But what we're finding, though, is not every group is equal when it comes to homeownership. There's an issue there. So, one of the big things that NAR is working on right now is addressing this homeownership gap, in particular, this Black homeownership gap, where we're seeing that huge loss in homeownership. And I should also mention that the rate as it is today is actually lower than the historical rate has been at times. So it's truly been a loss in homeownership. So one of the things that we're doing at NAR is, we've kind of banded together with fellow groups, so with the mortgage bankers, with our home builders, but also with community focus groups and consumer advocates like the National Housing Conference and the National Fair Housing Alliance, as well as our friends in NAR and NAR, to develop legislative and regulatory solutions to the homeownership gap. It's an entity called the Black Homeownership Collaborative, and it is coming together to really try and come up with practical solutions, such as practical forms of legislation, regulation, practical forms of guidance we can give to states and communities to really address this gap. We at NAR have actually taken a lead to help develop some of these proposals under the guidance of our Vice President of Advocacy, Brian Green, who I'd mentioned earlier. So what are a couple of the things, more particularly that we're looking at? One big thing is down payment assistance, for example. As I mentioned, if you've got a lot of debt, and what we're seeing in our research is down payments are a real barrier, especially to some of these protected groups, especially when you're talking about Black home ownership. So there's obviously down payment assistance at the state and local level. I think most down payment assistance programs function locally. What we're looking at is how do we create a federal down payment assistance program? How do we create a national one that has the purview of the federal government, the oversight of the federal government? It's an interesting thing. There actually isn't one right now, but there is some legislation out there that would create a program. It would be first-time homebuyer and first generation, right? So it'd be combining those two things to kind of get at people who really would need assistance. It would be developing grants of, just 20,000, something just to help a little bit. And, the funding would come ideally from Treasury. So, it's a simple program and it's a small amount of money, but the idea is that if you make enough of these small, simple changes, you might be able to affect the actual change that you're looking for. It's all part of building this huge thing. Another thing we're looking at is the idea of credit. One of the biggest things we see in our research, and I've actually, I hear from members. A couple of weeks ago, I was giving a talk like this, and somebody really brought up the problem of FICO scores and credit, and how much, having a poor FICO score really unfairly causes their clients to get a higher rate in financing, even if you've got somebody who pays their rent on time, you've got somebody who pays their utility bills, but in the magic of how you create a FICO score, those things don't count. So what we call it is in the industry, you call it alternative forms of credit. And it really is just looking at things like, are you paying your rent on time? Do you pay your utility bills? It's not just about the credit you have, like a credit card type credit and things like that, and whether or not those are part of it. There are plenty of reasons people don't have credit cards, but they're not a credit risk. They're just choosing not to have it, but they're still doing all the things we as society tell them to do to be financially responsible. They have every right to have financing that is affordable. But yet, if you rely on a FICO score or on a traditional credit score, that's not going to happen. We actually even had engaged with some academics recently, and we had a big event at NAR. It's actually on our website. I'll put some links in when I'm done, so you can go back and see it. That kind of was a policy paper that went to various forms of alternative credit, ways that you can kind of capture how someone is doing, and how that can be used practically. And then we had some people come in. Vantage Score comes to mind, but there's some other entities that are actually in this field looking and seeing, like, what can we do? How are ways that we can create ways for lenders to see that somebody is not a credit risk, that somebody is a good chance and they deserve fair financing. Another thing, are simple changes when it comes to the student loan issue. I don't know if y'all know this, but the way FHA, for example, which is a very popular loan product, and that historically is a loan product that serves many underrepresented groups, the way they tackle the student loan, it's not actually the debt of the student loan. It's a funny little calculation of what the debt could be. But we would argue that, well, no, it's whatever somebody is actually paying, whatever their monthly payment is on their student loan, that's what their limit is in terms of being able to repay a mortgage. So it's just, again, looking at things simply, coming up with simple fixes that, it might be a small thing, but it all adds up to really help improve what's going on in terms of that. We're also seeing, and I mean, it's not just NAR coming up with this. As I mentioned, these are all bills. So, I mean, Capitol Hill is very focused on this issue right now. I can tell you that since this new Congress met in January, there's been, gosh, like 5, 6 hearings focused purely on issues of fair lending, of fair housing, of discrimination in loans and student loans. I mean, it's really incredible the amount of attention that the lawmakers are focusing on these issues that touch on fair housing. And, it's kind of good to see that, because it tells me, whether or not a specific bill may or may not get passed, it just shows me that this is where Congress is right now. Congress is very focused on fair housing and fair housing issues. This is not something that's, not happening. It is very much happening. It's very much happening at the forefront. And I think as realtors, that gives us a really good position to be able to talk about these issues and to advocate, where we stand on them, and to have it heard. In addition, obviously there's well, I guess still a relatively new administration. The Biden administration has come into power this year. And, one thing we've seen definitely coming out of this administration is they really truly care about this idea of fairness. Obviously fair housing, but, honestly, you're seeing it in how they tackle labor issues and employment issues as well. So I would point out that, one of the first few things this administration did, the Biden administration did, was release several executive orders back in, I think it was January or maybe early February. And, 2 of them were very explicitly fair housing matters. One was the Preventing and Combating Discrimination on the Basis of Gender ID and Sexual Orientation. All this really did was it told the federal agencies that if you have a complaint of discrimination, that complaint of discrimination alleges discrimination based on gender identity or sexual orientation, it counts. It counts as part of sex discrimination, which is great, because that's actually where NAR has stood for since 2009 and 2013. In our code of ethics, we believe that gender identity and sexual orientation should be protected classes. So federal government getting in line with NAR, it's great. In addition, there was another EO, and this was the Advancing Racial Equity and Support for Underserved Communities Through the Federal Government. Now, that advancing racial equity, I'm sure you guys have probably heard a lot of talk about equity versus equality in the news. And, the simplest way that I try to think about it is, equity is trying to get to fairness, but not just fairness about how everything looks right now in the snapshot of right now, but fairness taking into consideration what might have happened in the past. I like to use the example of a relay race. So a relay race, you have legs of runners, right? Like there's a first runner, then a second runner on the different teams. Let's say at the start of the race, someone illegally holds back one of the runners, like just holds them back. So then they're at a disadvantage. And, they're running, but, it's almost impossible to catch up to the other runners. Even if this held back runner was faster than all of them in a fair race, in an unfair race, they just can't catch up. Well, let's go to this next leg. You've got, 4 more runners. You could argue that, well, they're all starting at the same time. But one of those runners relies on that runner who is held behind to help them, to move them forward. So much of how American wealth has been generated and how much communities have grown and developed, and which communities have access to, certain types of help and certain types of products and whatnot versus others, has to do with historical wrongs, with historical practices like redlining, with destroying neighborhoods to make way for highways, with all sorts of things that are now illegal, and that obviously NAR was complicit in, but so was the federal government, right? Nobody was clean. But it essentially created an unfair system, an unfair starting point that is almost next to impossible for some communities to then catch up. So equity kind of goes to that. It's like, how do we correct these historical bad practices, but without obviously harming anybody else? It's not about taking something from someone and giving it to someone else. It's just, how can we make it truly fair again? Now, specifically with fair housing, with this particular EO, it directed HUD and other agencies, but HUD to look at affirmatively advancing equality. So for HUD, this means the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule. So what this rule was essentially a rule that tied HUD funding to whether or not a locality could show that they were advancing fairness in housing. There's a lot of discussion on how you do that, what that looks like. So it was always kind of a bit of a contentious rule because that's a real conversation to have, how to check that. The past administration, the Trump administration, has just sort of just pulled that rule out. They weren't even kind of dealing with it. We know that the Biden administration is now focused on that, affirmatively furthering fair housing. We know that they intend to release a proposed rule on it. I don't know when. There's a lot they obviously want to do and have to do, but we know that it's something that's coming down the line, and that's something that affects realtors and affects communities. So it's something, you know, we want to be aware of as an association as well. Another big issue that we know HUD is working on is rules on disparate impact. Disparate impact is just a theory of how you show discrimination. So, you know, there's kind of a direct impact theory where it's very intentional, very obvious somebody is doing something to discriminate. Disparate impact is more about that you might have a policy or a program, and the way it's written, it's not discriminatory, right? I'm not talking about intent. I'm not talking about whether people who wrote it want to or don't want to discriminate. It's more about just the fact that how it is written, the how of it, doesn't show discrimination in the words. However, when it comes into practice, when you're actually applying it into the world, it has the effect of discriminating against a protected group. There was a big Supreme Court case in 2019 that actually outlined how they think disparate impact in housing should work. So while we know that the Trump administration, last administration, had proposed a rule about disparate impact, especially following that Supreme Court case, our understanding is that proposed rule is just gone, right? This is what happens when you change administrations. So we believe that HUD, this current HUD, this Biden HUD, has actually, you know, kind of developed their own disparate impact rule. What we know is that whatever they've developed is actually being reviewed by the Office of Management and Budget. That is an office in the federal government that just, it checks on rules for a lot of bureaucratic reasons to make sure they're following certain nitty-gritty rules of the federal government, making sure they're financing of the rules all matches up. But what that really says is that this HUD is pushing this disparate impact rule sooner than later. If it's at OMB, that means it's already in the works, it's already being engaged, they're working on it. So I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of the year, we actually see a Biden disparate impact rule. And, you know, that'll be interesting because, again, that's something that, you know, realtors should have an interest in. They should want to talk about it. And, you know, we have obviously committees and people who will be kind of would go over it and to see. Don't know what exactly will be in it. My guess, and this is just my educated guess, is they would track that Supreme Court rule, the Supreme Court case that came out, because at the end of the day, if the Supreme Court and all the courts of the land are following a certain line of rules, to me, it just makes sense you would then follow it in the federal government system. Otherwise, you run into a lot of court cases. But like I said, it's just a guess. All right, so I am looking at the time, and this always happens. Never have enough time to talk about everything. So I just really quickly, there was all sort of a lot of the policy stuff we're working on. We have a lot of great fair housing programs we're working on at NAR. I hope many of you have taken Fairhaven. It's nar.realtor/Fairhaven. It is actually an online fair housing education module. It is very, very cool. It uses storytelling to teach fair housing issues. It really puts you, the person going through it, in the place of not just an agent, but also a buyer and seller. And, you know, it really makes you kind of feel what it might be like to be in a situation where there could be discrimination. I really urge everyone to take it if you haven't already. You just need a NERDS number and you're good to go. We're working on developing an implicit bias training for realtors. It's actually being piloted in 3 states right now. Our goal is to have this NAR approved implicit bias training that'll be 3 hours long, available for CE credit. So, you know, that just to help our members, right? Like really at the end of the day, as I said, we want to make fair housing a part of everything, and we want to make sure you, our members, you know, are being served by NAR when it comes to wanting to do the right thing and, you know, really follow all the rules of fair housing. Okay, so I'll now stop talking and I'm happy to take any questions. Oh, and just really quickly, I'm just putting in the chat a link to our Fair Housing Month resources, which has a lot of great tools, toolkits. It has recordings of events we've done. So I definitely suggest you check that out as well. And I'll also put my email in there too, if anybody wants to reach out after the event.
I've got a question. So here.
Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. What's NAR doing as it relates to membership in the disparity between the membership? I mean, as you look across the nation, whites predominantly are the holders of Realtor Association membership. Is NAR, are there any active programs related to that, especially stuff that local associations can tie into?
Yeah, no, and so I'm really glad you asked that. So I will say that that's actually covered by our diversity inclusion team, but I do know that they have quite a few things in the works. So one thing that they're exploring is they're trying to develop a stronger mentor-mentee type program, and this would be something that would happen at the local level. And the idea is, engaging people who are, I want to say either high school or college age, right? And with an avenue for looking towards diversity within those ranks, and maybe engaging people who wouldn't normally think about real estate as a career into it. Because we know a lot from our research that a lot of the real estate careers, they're almost familial, right? Like you get into real estate because your family's into real estate or your friend is into real estate, right? So if you're someone who's coming from a community that just isn't there, you may not think about it. So they're actually really trying to come up with, a program, and I know that they've reached out to a few members to it's the very early phases and really trying to develop it, see what works, talk to people who might have programs in their local associations. But I know that's like a big thing that they're trying to get out is, develop some sort of mentor-mentee program for the local level that would help improve diversity and reach, again, those kids who might, not have that familial connection that normally gets you into real estate.
Thank you.
Great. Anyone else have any other questions? I know I crammed a lot in there.
Thank you for the presentation. Appreciate it.
No, of course.
Oh, you do it.
No, we're here to support you guys. So please do, if you think of anything, please feel free to email me, ask away. Check out the resources on our Fair Housing Month event. I think we had, I know, so this was just scheduled for the first 30 minutes, so I don't want to take any more time because I know time is precious to everybody.
Awesome.
Awesome. Thank you, Sahar. We appreciate you presenting all that great information today for us. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for having me today.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.